The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled," and it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
You know, my biggest fear of 2021, after the crushing disappointment of a year like 2020, is that we expect far too little of ourselves and of God. See, all the uncertainty, all the change, all the disruption means that we could just stumble into 2021 without any vision or real hope and not expect God to break out in the very ordinary parts of our lives. So I'm here to speak into this. And I know we need care and we need pastoral wisdom. But another route through the mess of the pandemic is a vision of something greater, to ask God for some dreams and visions that will push us through any apathy or depression that's still lingering and that often just smothers our passion and love. So instead, over these next 4 weeks, we're going to study the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, which is full of incredible turnarounds in a series which we're calling God's Mercies in the Shadows. Now, the chances are, if you've read Ruth or heard people preach on it before, it's sometimes treated like a romantic novel. So where the poor peasant girl Ruth is rescued by the noble prince Boaz. And somehow he's the hero of the story, which is not only wrong on a number of levels, because we all know Jesus is the hero of all the stories, but it's also quite damaging, because it gives the impression that marriage is the goal for everyone and that women are not quite complete without finding their Boaz. I don't like that at all. It's not how the Bible understands singleness and marriage. And also, sometimes Naomi is seen as the sad, grumpy lady who changes her name from Naomi, which means sweetness, to after her husband and 2 sons die, to Mara, which means bitter. And with this, she's sort of held up as an example of how not to do grief. And I just think that's pretty unfair and unwarranted. I think it's far better to think of Naomi as in the same category as Job. So Naomi suffers hugely. She loses her husband and then suffers the premature death of both her sons. She faces all of this in a foreign land with no family and as a woman without the advantages that Job would have had, and is honest about her pain, but emerges from the struggle knowing God's mercy and moves from emptiness into fullness through a series of selfless acts of loyal love. And so just sort of perhaps pushing aside perhaps some preconceptions about what the book of Ruth is about, my job today is to give you 2 reasons why we should expect God to inspire us afresh and help us find his mercies in the shadows. So first up, I want to talk about women being celebrated and prized. You see, Ruth 1 verse 1 starts like this. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So that tells us that this story took place in the time of the judges. This was the 400-year period after Israel entered the promised land under Joshua, but before there were any kings in Israel. So it was roughly 1500 to 1100 BC. And the nation was in a mess. So if you've ever watched any Mad Max movies, or perhaps you've seen or read The Road, or any sort of apocalyptic film, that's the feel of the nation. In the final 3 chapters of Judges, you find one of the most evil and goriest stories in the whole of the Bible. It's the disturbing account of the rape and the dissection of the Levite's concubine. You find that in Judges 19 through to 21. A concubine is like a second wife who has got very little status or power. And from what we can tell, this Levite doesn't even have a first wife, so he seems to be using this woman right from the start. And we're told that she's unfaithful to him, but this doesn't seem to consist of her going off with someone else so much as her just going back to Bethlehem. And eventually the Levite goes to Bethlehem to find her, and on his way home they're invited to stay at a man's house in Gibeah. And after an evening of food and wine, randomly the men of the city start banging on the door and they want to rape the Levite. And so the host, the old man, horrifically offers his virgin daughter and the concubine rather than give over the man. And instead the Levite grabs hold of his concubine and thrusts her out, sparing us the details. The narrator tells the horror story. Verse 19. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. And when the master got up in the morning, they opened the door of the house and stepped out to go on his way. And there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, her hands on the threshold. So he's had a good night's sleep. She's been outside. He opens the door of the house because she's been shut out of it. He was about to continue on his way, so it's business as usual for him. But there she lay, so close yet so far, without any hint of love. The Levite continues. He says to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. And then the man took her on his donkey and set out for home. And when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts and sent them to all the areas of Israel. So we're not even told if she dies on the doorstep or on the donkey or by his knife. And the story is shocking. It's shocking because it summarises, if you like, the attitude of society to all women. So what happens to this one woman is sort of echoed in how society was treating all of its women. And so you feel the injustice of it all, and you ask yourself, what on earth does God think of this? And the answer is the book of Ruth. So incredibly, sort of bumped right up to this horror story in our English Bibles is Naomi's story. You go from Judges straight to Ruth. It speaks of a woman's perspective on subjects that women may face in life. Things like widowhood and marriage, barrenness and childbirth, single parenting, loss of a child and being a caregiver. And it's fascinating, men are just not the focus at all. In fact, all the key men die within the first 5 verses, which for a book written in a patriarchal society is just unbelievable. And then it tracks with Naomi and Ruth and their amazing struggle and survival against the odds in the workplace and in a community and in a legal system. And it's not just about any old woman, but widows. Widows were probably the most vulnerable in society. They didn't have social or economic power, and they didn't have a voice. In fact, the Hebrew word for widow comes from the root word, which means mute or unable to speak, which just sort of exemplifies a widow's sense of being unheard and unseen in that day. And they weren't just widows, but widows that couldn't have children. They were right at the bottom of the social ladder. But by the end of the story, in chapter 4, the people of Bethlehem declare that Ruth is worth more to Naomi than 7 sons. And ancient culture just didn't do this for women. And whereas the Levite's concubine was left for dead while her cruel master lived, in Ruth, these men who actually abandon God's land die, while the women who are courageous enough to return will live and prosper. The book of Ruth even passes the Bechdel test. I don't know if you've heard of that, but the Bechdel test is a way of evaluating whether or not a film or other works of fiction portray women in a way that's sexist or characterised by gender stereotyping. So in order to pass the Bechdel test, it needs to meet 3 basic criteria. 1, there needs to be a conversation between 2 female characters. 2, both of which are named. And 3, do they talk about anything other than the male character? And it's just so scary how many films and books don't pass that simple test. For those of you that are Disney fans, apparently 50% of Disney films don't pass that test either. And just the fact that we've got that test reflects a world that we live in where women's stories are often not heard or valued. They're not taken seriously. And this is not God's heart. You see, when a man finally appears in the story, Boaz, we're going to find out how a man should treat a woman who is left alone at night, in contrast to the book of Judges. We're going to see a man who isn't diminished by having such strong women around him, but rather he goes stronger. He grows stronger in his relations with them and is enabled to be a kinsman redeemer who restores these women at great cost to himself. This story shows us that God is interested in a hopeless world with hopeless characters. He sees these women and knows them. He wants their story told. But you and I know that we live in a world where the plight of women like this is still ignored and unheard. You know, incredibly, 9 out of 10 wives will spend some portion of their lives in widowhood. So 9 out of 10 women that are married will spend some portion of their lives in widowhood. It's just crazy that widows and women in our culture are not valued as they should. As someone who's bringing up a daughter and seeing her emerge into adulthood, I'm very conscious of the world she is emerging into, where women are often seen as less than the men around them. You know, I hope I'm not being patronising here. I don't mean to be at all, but we understand the Bible says that women are made in the image and likeness of God. They are image bearers, equally called to fruitfulness, extending the kingdom of God. For every woman that is watching this, you are valuable and capable of doing the work of God. Like whatever your past or your present, whatever you've done, whatever that has been done to you. And even though many of you, I think, have been undervalued by our culture and sadly in the church, the Bible teaches that you are vital for God's plans for the renewal of all things. You have dreams and visions for 2021 that need to be seen, need to be heard, need to be released. See, women need to be released and supported in our church family. The church is stronger with you leading. And Naomi and Ruth are just such great examples of this. You must realise, for this story to be told over and over again, over hundreds of years to the people of God, for 2 childless widows and one of them a refugee, a foreigner, turning back to God and being welcomed into his plans for the world, says everything about the grace and inclusiveness of a loving God and the goodness of the gospel. God is the God of the poor, the God of the marginalised, the God of the oppressed, the beaten down, the foreigner. But he's also the God who lifts up women. And I want all of you in our church family, but especially the women at Mosaic, to know God sees you and has plans to prosper you in 2021. You may feel abandoned, or you may be enduring heartbreak right now. Maybe life has dealt you a blow. You feel up against it. But listen, I would love for you to be encouraged today from this story, for you to find that mercy in the shadows. And more than that, maybe even to dream again with God. You know, what are his plans for your life in this city? What has he called you to at work and at home and at church? What needs to be released off you so that you can step into these things? You know, we need you. God sees you. And I'd love you at the start of this year to feel that fresh sense of faith, to move beyond whatever is in your present and to step into what God has for you. And if you're doing that already, we just want to cheer you on. And maybe this week in your mission groups, you can hear from some of the women in your group what they feel called to and what their dreams are, so that we can really back them, support them as church family. So the first mercy in the shadow is women being celebrated and prized. But the second one is that we find loyal love for the loveless. So we're told in chapter 1 that Naomi leaves Bethlehem with her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons, and they move to Moab. You can see that on the map. You can see their journey to Moab and then back again. Bethlehem, which means house of bread, is empty. So the land is in famine, so they leave. However, Elimelech, who's Naomi's husband, dies, and her 2 sons marry 2 women from Moab, who are called Ruth and Orpah. And 10 years later, the sons sadly also die, leaving these 3 widows, 2 of which are infertile, so the family line is ending. Naomi is just left with nothing. She's got no husband or son, she's unprotected, she hasn't got an income, housing, a future. And so what does she do? She aims to return to her hometown, to Bethlehem. And as they leave, she begs her 2 daughters-in-law to return home and let her travel alone. In Ruth 1 verse 8 we read, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So there we have another mercy in the shadow. Naomi prays that these daughters-in-law will know the loving kindness of God. That Hebrew word in verse 8 there is the Hebrew word hesed. I think you pronounce it chesed, but I don't want to do that for the rest of today. So let's say hesed. And it means loyal love. And even though this word is mentioned only 3 times in the book of Ruth, it seems to be a theme of the whole story. It describes what happens when someone with power or resources to make a difference decides to use them to help someone who needs it. It's also about promise-keeping love. So it's about a feeling and an action. It involves going beyond the call of duty. It's loyal love. It's committed affection. We don't really have a word for it in English. But it's the love that Jesus shows us as Christians. It's the love that we really need from God. And it's the love that we need to show to our city. It's a beautiful thing. And Naomi displays hesed love to her daughters-in-law because technically at this point they're her property. Because of the situation in the family, they sort of belong to her, but she lets them go. She chooses this harder, more vulnerable life without them so that they can choose a new life. Hesed, I think probably one of the best sort of equivalents that I see in the world today of hesed love is shown by foster parents. Because it's costly, it's sacrificial, it's choosing the harder route in order to show love. You know, I was reading one post by a foster parent who was revealing to the world, I guess, the cost of fostering in a simple post of a toothbrush. And she said this: "It took his left behind toothbrush to undo me. I'm sitting here in a parking lot sobbing my guts out. He was mine for 2.5 weeks, but those days and nights saw him smile, sleep through the night instead of freezing awake in terror, swinging for hours on the swings my kids take for granted. He called me mama, and I told him every time that I left, if I said I would come back, I would. I wonder where they are now. They visit me in my dreams, and sometimes I wake up with a wet face. It hurts as I think back to those children I've cared for, and sometimes in those moments it hurts me to breathe." Despite these difficulties that must come with fostering, she explains just how important it was to put your heart into these children's lives. She said, "I'd rather these sweet babies know my love than never know it." And that is hesed. That's Naomi-like costly love. And so while Orpah does the obvious thing and eventually goes home, this decision of Naomi's forces Ruth to make a radical choice that forces out the best in her and gives room for God to work a miracle. So verse 16, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. So Ruth is far from this sort of passive, deferential, demure woman, but is a surprisingly gutsy risk taker. She discards the cultural protocols, her own hopes for happiness, and embraces Naomi, her God, and her crisis. She displays hesed love for Naomi, and you can hear her faithfulness, her determination, her faith. It's a remarkable promise that she makes. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people become my people. Your God becomes my God. Where you die, I will die. Ruth is just determined that nothing, even death, will separate her from Naomi and her God. It's a commitment that's lifelong, that's no holds barred. It's the sort of love that I see all around me in our church life. I see it sometimes in the news. I was reading recently about Nimco Ali and her organisation Daughters of Love. Nimco was born in Somalia but had to flee because of the war there, and so she ended up moving to the UK and had sort of a very normal upbringing here. But when she was 7, she was taken on holiday, and it was there she became a victim of female genital mutilation, or FGM. And then she was just brought home again, and the family never ever spoke about it, and it was just like this secret, painful thing that she had experienced. But when she went to school, she found out that 13 out of the 14 other Somalian girls had experienced the same thing and had become FGM survivors. And she realised in those moments that her silence would mean that she would become complicit in the evil that was happening in her community. So after graduating, she began speaking about her experience. Took huge courage, campaigning, helping police and local and central government realise the horror and extent of the problem. She helped set up a helpline, and at that point the persecution started. She received credible death threats, and it absolutely stopped her in her tracks. She had to make a decision on whether she was to go on. But she decides to carry on. And so for her, 3 generations had been cut, but she managed to stop it happening to the 4th generation. Just like Ruth, she chooses the harder, more costly route to show hesed to her community and hundreds of other girls like her. In 1 generation, FGM was stopped in her family. Ruth chooses a harder, more costly life in order to do hesed. And communities that embrace hesed love will share in each other's pain, will feel pain, not just their own, but other people's pain, and willingly will have a life of more sadness, knowing there is joy to come, but we're happy to make the sacrifice now for others to be brought in to the love that we have been shown by Jesus. How do we do it? Is it that some people are just more loving than others? Is it that we just need to try really hard at the beginning of the year to discipline ourselves to show hesed love? Well, it may be helpful to think how Ruth did it. For Ruth the Moabite, she embraced Naomi's God. In verse 17, we're told, may the Lord deal with me, she says, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. So somehow after 10 years of living with Naomi, she knew the God of Hesed. So when she reaches this crossroads, she could do Hesed because she knew the God of Hesed. And if that's true for her, how much more is that true for us as we have seen the embodiment of Hesed love in Jesus Christ, who sets us free at great cost to himself on the cross and dies so that we can know God. Jesus, if you like, is the true and better Ruth, because he chooses to make his life infinitely worse to make our lives infinitely better. He commits to us knowing suffering awaits. He says to each one of you, where you go, I will go, and not even death will separate us. And so it's Jesus that can empower us and give us strength to make life harder in order to love further. And that's a wonderful thing to commit to at the start of 2021. So perhaps a way through for many of us is to demonstrate Hesed love. Perhaps if we want to make 2021 a different sort of year, like who in our church family could you reach out to? Who in our city could you reach out to? Is there someone younger that you can be a Naomi to? Is there someone older you can be a Ruth to? Are there people in your life that need someone to stand up for them? Listen, there are many more mercies in the shadows in the book of Ruth, but we've looked at 2 today. We've seen women are celebrated and prized, and we've seen loyal love for the loveless. Let's draw closer to Jesus now in worship. Let's declare truth about God. Let's declare who he is and how he loves, and receive what we need to be his people. And then in a moment we will pray together.